and thanks so much to everyone for coming out today. I'm looking forward to telling you a bit about my research and to hearing all of your thoughts and questions. So this talk is drawn from my current book project, which is based on my dissertation research, and this is one of the chapters that didn't quite make it into the dissertation. You know, when you have to finish things on a schedule, that kind of thing happens, but I've been working on this recently. And we're going to be talking about vineyards, orchards, and gardens in early medieval Brittany. So for this talk, first, I'm going to start by introducing you all to my study region, to Brittany, to my period, and briefly talking about what kinds of sources we have for this period that I'm going to be using in the context of environmental history. And then we're going to get into the details. What do we know about these particular landscape types, and what do these kinds of different sources, what can they tell us, and also what don't they tell us? So starting off, early medieval Brittany. Brittany is, of course, this kind of northwestern peninsula of France. The borders of Brittany are pretty fluid in the early Middle Ages, so we don't have a particular boundary that we're looking at. It's generally that little northwestern corner spanning from around Nantes and then up past Rennes, up north. And when I say early medieval, I mean from between 500 to 1000 AD, although, as you will soon see, the textual sources are pretty clustered within that period. The vast majority of them date from the 9th century, though we do have a little bit going earlier. So a lot of this is going to be from the 9th century. So within the textual sources, there are two main bodies of text that were produced in Brittany during this period. The first one that I'm going to be talking about is hagiographies, so writings about the lives and deeds and miracles of different Breton saints. There was a fairly large cohort of Breton saints. Usually their saints' lives tell us that they came from the British Isles, traveled over to Brittany in around the 5th, 6th century, so they were part of that kind of Breton migration movement, and there's a lot of debate about what that actually encompassed and who was involved. But the textual sources will tell us that a bunch of saints were involved in leading the charge and founding these new monasteries that kind of go around, mostly around the coast in Brittany. So there are some challenges with these sources. Normally they're talking about monastic foundations in around the 6th century, but our texts are normally from the 9th century. So that's something to bear in mind when we look at what they say about the natural world. Are they describing the reality of the 9th century or the 6th or something in between? Also, as you can see from this map that I've plotted, this is where they tend to spatially skew. A lot about the coastlands where these saints were arriving, and they chose those locations for their monastic foundations most of the time. And I'm happy to talk about why, but that unfortunately isn't really related to gardens and vineyards, so you'll have to ask later if you want to know more about that. So then the other main body of text that we have are our charters. So charters are short administrative documents. They record the deeds of sale of normally lands and normally to monastic institutions. They don't need to. You could have a charter between a priest or a cleric or between two lay people, but because of the way these documents are preserved, most of the ones that we have now are from these large monastic institutions. The two main bodies are from the monastery of Redon and from the monastery of Landévennec. So here I've plotted references in appurtenance clauses to landscapes. I'll talk more about that later, don't worry. In Redon's charters, so you can see where it clusters around the monastery. So again, these kind of sources, they're very easy to date. We know usually exactly when they were written down to the day. They're pretty easy to localize. They tend to say exactly where the landscapes they were, and we can very often trace that to modern day towns and villages. But they don't cover the whole of Brittany, as you can see. The charters of Redon, this is most of the charters that we have, are very much skewed towards this southeast. So that's the kinds of landscapes that we're going to get access to from these texts. Now, going outside of the textual side, I've been looking in my research at evidence from archaeobotany and from palynology, and this talk I'm going to focus mostly on archaeobotany. So these are plant remains, larger plant remains than pollen. Pollen is microscopic, so we're looking at larger remains, nuts, seeds, little leaves or anything like that were preserved and brought to archaeological sites and that we find in archaeological deposits. So this is really useful in a lot of ways. It tells us what kind of plants people were interacting with, what they were choosing to bring and to use and to eat or to cook with, all that kind of detail that we can get. And also, a lot of these archaeological sites are not specifically monastic sites. We have some urban sites, we have some monastic sites. There have been excavations at Landévennec and Redon, for instance. But there's also rural sites that are just showcasing rural holdings, so it can tell us more about the kinds of people that get left out of the textual record. But these kinds of sources are also not easy to work with sometimes. They can be hard to categorize. This is what these samples look like in practice. So thankfully, I'm not an archaeobotanist and trying to distinguish what all of these are, but very, very talented and dedicated professionals are doing that work. So sometimes it can be hard to tell different plant species apart. Some different plant species don't survive very well in the record, and we will be talking about that later in the presentation. And also, in terms of the geographic skew, here are some of the sites that have done archaeobotanical work in Brittany up till now. And as you can see, there's a decent range, and it's always improving. But the largest cluster is over here to the east. And the reason for that is that these are archaeological studies that are drawn from rescue archaeology. So that means whenever you need to build a new road, a new highway, a new development, anything like that, the government will send in the archaeologists to make sure that there's nothing of important heritage that's going to be destroyed through that construction process. So Rennes is the major urban center in Brittany, and that is where most of the construction work takes place. That is where most of our archaeological sites, at least so far, are. So we're kind of looking at not places that archaeologists are just choosing to dig because they think it'll yield good results, but because this is where this kind of these developments are taking place. So that's why we have this. So in my dissertation, I was trying to kind of layer these different source bases in my mind to try to figure out what can we say about this region, where are the gaps that we still don't have information for, where do we have a pretty good amount of information, where do these sources agree with each other, where do they disagree with each other, and when we take all of that in consideration, what does it tell us about how people were interacting, engaging with, changing their natural world around them. So with all of that preamble, now let's get into the gardens and the orchards and the vineyards. So I'm going to start with gardens and orchards. So gardens and orchards were pretty important landscapes for a practical reason. Providing fruits and vegetables was pretty essential. It's essential for monastic communities. We see it a lot in the saints' lives, and gardens are mentioned very often in stories of monastic foundations. For instance, in the foundation of Landévennec by Winwallow, classic 6th century foundation that we hear about in the 9th century. We hear that Winwallow and his disciples set out to try to found their new monastery. They picked a site that they thought would be suitable, and the first thing that they did was they created an oratory, a couple dwellings to live in, and a garden. So that tells us how essential these were for these kinds of projects. However, after 3 years, they realized they couldn't stay in that site anymore because it was very inhospitable. There was a lot of winds. It was really cold. It just wasn't a place where they thought they could stay long term. So they cast their minds around for where else can we go that's in this nearby area that would be a better place for the monastery than the one that we have chosen. That is too windy. We can't live here anymore. So when they were thinking about that, they realized that while there was a hill where they had gone to sit and teach, and from that hill they could see a lovely woodland located on one of the mountains with a valley in the middle, suitable for a garden at the bottom. So the garden's back again when they're thinking about where they're going to choose for their next location. So they thought this site looked pretty good. So when they actually reached there and went across the bay this is on the coast, but across a bay to get to what would become the site of Landévennec, they found that it was even more beautiful than anything that they could have imagined, that they could have seen from afar. They saw that it was sunny and pleasant like a paradise in full sight of sunset, with bursting each year with flowers and seeds dropping its leaves, prepared by God, decorated with every color of flower, in which not only terrestrial but also celestial fruits can be obtained. So here we get the kind of dual meaning of gardens in these hagiographical sources. They are practical landscapes that monasteries need in order to get the fruits and vegetables and herbs that they need for their daily supplies. And they're also doing this work of showcasing the celestial fruits of the land that the monks are coming to. So they're showing these monks being favored by God. And of course, the references here to the Garden of Eden is incredibly, incredibly clear. This is very typical in saints' lives. This kind of description where the site that would turn into the site of the monastery is described as a paradise-like garden abounding in all different kinds of, flowers, trees, vegetables, vineyards, all of that, all those kinds of productive landscapes. We see this over and over again. In practice, there's also some evidence that things weren't necessarily like that on the ground. In the Vita of Winwellow, once they decide that this is going to be their site, they then set to work to actually make it a site for a monastery. And that takes quite a lot of labor, as our saint's life tells us. They set about working on it, thinking about how they're going to go about this, like bees to an apiary, where each bee has its role within the hive, and they're all working harmoniously under the rulership of the king bee. That's what it says in the saint's life. We've had some further biology studies since then, but either way. And just like the bees that are all working harmoniously for the betterment of the hive, the monks all have their different roles to play. Again, here we're getting the idea that the monks themselves are engaging in a lot of manual labor. Whether or not that's fully accurate is a separate conversation, but that's at least what they want to portray in these documents. And according to these documents, only the saint himself was free to actually spend his entire day in prayer. Everybody else had to be doing some manual labor alongside their prayer. So this kind of story, which is just about the foundation of Landévennec, shows this kind of duality in how gardens are portrayed, and the kind of differences with the realities on the ground in terms of preparing lands for cultivation and the work that took, with the kind of Edenic paradise recollections that gardens have and that are repeatedly portrayed in these sources. So how did monastic gardens actually function? Do we have more information about how they were maintained, about what kinds of fruits and vegetables and herbs we get? There are a few stories that we can turn to try to get some further information. For instance, we hear that the monastic garden of Redon was manned by a certain monk called Condillac, who was the monastic gardener, so that was a dedicated role. And we hear that one day Condillac was dealing with an infestation of caterpillars that attacked all the vegetables, leaving almost nothing left. So this might be familiar to people who are into gardening, dealing with pest infestations. In a somewhat unorthodox gardening practice, though, Condillac is able to remove the caterpillars by praying, and then they all retreated. So you can try that on your garden and let me know how that goes. But it worked really well in this case. And this is not the only story where we have pests in the gardens. There's another story in a different saint's life that's talking about a fox that needed to be chased away from the garden. Interestingly, though, we're more likely to find human pests rather than animal ones in our saints' lives when we talk about the difficulties in maintaining these gardens. For instance, also from the garden at Redon, we hear that there was a certain peasant man called Ubri who saw the 4 monastic beehives and tried to steal one away. But of course, when he tried to leave the garden with it, he found that he couldn't remove it from his shoulder. He walked around all night trying to free himself from it and was eventually driven mad and exhausted. So he returned to the monastery. He confessed to the monks that he had attempted to steal their beehive, and they forgave him, then gave him some food and drink. And he then was able to remove the beehive and to leave. So this tells us something about what kinds of things you could find in the garden. And obviously here we have a cautionary tale for anyone who would dare to try to take anything illicitly from these places. There's also a more serious incident in the life of Saint Samson of Dol, where we find that a wicked miller who hated Samson and had a grudge against him tried to poison the saint using poisonous herbs found from the monastic garden. He actually, to check the strength of his poison, he poisoned the monastery's cat by poisoning its milk, and the cat died immediately. But of course, when he went to put those herbs in the saint's cup, he did that with everybody. Usually it was medicinal herbs, but secretly he switched them out for Samson with poisonous herbs. And Samson did the sign of the cross over his cup, and then he was able to drink it unharmed. And this eventually came to light, and the miller was foiled in this plan here. So again, now we get an idea that there's medicinal or maybe poisonous or maybe both herbs to be found in these gardens. I know that this is fairly vague. Unfortunately, this is what we're dealing with from the textual record. When it comes to fruiting trees and orchards, these are very frequently depicted among the range of landscapes that we get in these paradise-like gardens, but normally not in much detail. We get fruiting trees along with sweet-smelling herbs and those kinds of more generic statements. So definitely orchards were present, and they're associated with gardens here. We don't get a lot of more detailed information. One example that we do have is from a saint's life, a miracle collection about a bunch of monks who wanted to form a new monastery. So they petitioned the Breton Duke Nomino to get some lands. He said, I'll give you some lands, only if you have relics. They said, we don't have any relics. He's like, well, go find some. You're not a real monastery unless you have relics. Once you have your relics, I'll give you some land. So they thought, where do we get some? We'll just take one from a local monastery. So they sail across to the island of Sark that held the relics of St. Maglorius. They take the relics and sail away, and after a bunch of hijinks, they eventually find themselves back in Brittany. And when now exhausted from all their adventures, they set about trying to prepare dinner. They have nowhere to put their relics, so they decide to go into a garden that they found there that was planted with fruit trees. And they see a certain tree that had very bitter tasting apples, whose trunk was divided into two parts with some branches going east, the others west. They put the relics on one of these branches and then sit down for their dinner. They had a great dinner, and at the end, one of the monks wanted to take one of the apples and eat it, kind of for dessert. The gardener, the man who owned this property, reached out and said, don't eat those. They are terrible. You definitely don't. They're really bitter. They're not for eating. So all of the monks threw the apples into the waste heap. They were like, oh, okay, I guess we won't. But one monk decided, they look good though. I want to try one. So he did, and he found that the apple was incredibly delicious. And when they investigated further, they found that only the half of the tree where the relics had been placed, only on that side had the apples become sweet. On the other side, they were still very bitter and not edible. So this is pretty much the only detailed description that we get of fruit trees in our hagiographies. It's not much, but this is what we have. There seems to have been apples, at least in this case, maybe, depending on how literally or accurately we think these stories are at depicting what we could find in orchards here. This is also from the 9th century, and this did take place in the 9th century, so at least there's that. When it comes to charter evidence, it's fairly thin for both gardens and orchards. There are a couple charters that mention lands that had gardens and orchards attached that would be sold to the monastery, and we have records of that. There's also one record of pear trees that's in a boundary clause of a different land. So for gardens, there's a couple references. We learned that the monastic garden of Redon was actually not at Redon itself. It was at a property 13 kilometers northeast. And we learn about who was running that and where that was, which is also interesting because it suggests that the fantastical description that we get, Redon was one of the monasteries where it's very much stressed how very beautiful the place was where they founded the site. They didn't actually choose that place for their monastic garden, which is interesting and might tell us something about how we should read that kind of evidence. We also get one description of a garden that did not belong to the monastery. It was a cleric who gifts a vineyard from within his garden in penance because he had attacked another priest and whipped him. So that's an interesting story, but that's all we get from that. So looking at all of this, the textual evidence together, we do have some information that we can get when we take a step back here. Most of the evidence we have in the text are about monastic gardens, but there are some small amount of evidence that suggests that these weren't the only gardens and orchards in operation. They're just the ones that the texts are biased towards. They had a dedicated monastic gardener. They were clearly important enough that foundation accounts talk about gardens as being one of the essential features in choosing your location for a new monastery. They had a range of produce. We know that there were vegetables. We don't get details on what kinds. We know that there were fruit trees. We don't get much details on what kinds either. We know that there were medicinal herbs, also poisonous herbs, and also beehives. So this is the kind of picture that we get from the texts. Now turning to the archaeobotanical evidence, we're dealing with different struggles, let's say, but also different potential from this source. So when it comes to our fruit trees, cultivated fruit trees we do see that in archaeobotanical assemblages. They're fairly rare due to taphonomic processes. So what I mean by that is they don't necessarily survive well because of where exactly we're looking and whether or not these seeds preserve well in these assemblages. So a lot of the archaeobotanical work that's been done in Brittany looks specifically at remains that have been carbonized, so they've been preserved because they've been burnt. So we're looking at drying ovens, fireplaces, that kind of thing. So we're going to find things that people were drying or burning. So if you want to know what kind of woods they were burning, we have quite a lot on that. A lot of cereals were dried as part of the process, so we have quite a lot of cereals there. But for fruits and vegetables that didn't require that particular kind of processing, we don't have very much from these particular deposits. There are more vegetables and fruits if you look at waste heaps, toilet heaps, those kinds of things. But there's been less work done on those in the sites in Brittany. So we don't have very much here that has survived. But there are still some. It is very common for archaeological sites to have a few preserved plant remains from fruits and vegetables. So when it comes to the fruits, the most common cultivated fruit trees that we see, we have cherry and plum, also peach, apple, medlar. And there's also a lot of wild fruits, which is not quite in the range of this presentation, but I thought worth mentioning. We have a lot of berries and wild fruits, strawberries, blackthorns, blackberries, elderberry, raspberry. These all often also come up on archaeological sites. It's hard to know how significant these were because we might get one or two of these seeds per site. So it's hard to know how important they were to people's diets. We don't have access to that kind of information from these sources, but they do appear regularly. When it comes to the vegetables, we have a similar kind of problem where they don't survive very well in the archaeobotanical assemblages that we have, but we still do see some. A range of vegetables. We have peas, lentils, beans, vetch, spinach, fennel, beetroot, parsnip, turnip. Some of these would have been planted in dedicated vegetable gardens. Some of them would have been alternated with cereal crops or grown alongside cereal crops, and they had some benefits for nitrogen fixation and things like that. So certainly fruits and vegetables were being planted. They did exist. People were eating them. It's hard to know exactly how significant they were to people's diets, but we do know that they were there and that people, we can find them on these archaeobotanical assemblages. We can find them on archaeological sites. And of course, this does prove that monastic gardens are not the only gardens to exist. These fruits and vegetables can be found on monastic sites, as well as in rural sites, as well as in urban sites. We find them everywhere. So this suggests that a much wider range of people were doing these kinds of landscape practices and were gardening and were maintaining orchards. So now on to vineyards. We have a slightly different story in some ways, but also we'll see quite a few similarities. Brittany is, I don't think when you hear Brittany, you think of wine today. It's not really known as a wine growing region. But there is a very long history of wine trade and wine cultivation in Brittany. When it comes to trade, there's evidence of wine amphorae being traded in the Iron Age in Brittany. Probably not grown in Brittany, but traded as part of larger trade networks. When it comes to vine cultivation, we have evidence of medieval vine cultivation going back to at least the 6th century because Gregory of Tours mentions it in his histories. He talks about how during a conflict between some Breton warlords and the Franks, one of them was the warlord Baroque was kind of rampaging the countryside between around Nantes and Rennes, so right at the east in those borderlands. And while he was there in the countryside, he took advantage by taking some wine back with him. So we know that in the 6th century, there was wine being grown in this kind of eastern part of Brittany. When it comes to our saints' lives, and I'm going to get into some of these examples in a second, there are quite a lot of references to wine. Unsurprisingly, wine is an essential part of the Christian liturgy. So any religious institution, any religious site would have to have some access to wine. So yes, they do talk about it fairly regularly in different contexts. There are a couple stories in our saints' lives where we see the monks themselves who are working in vineyards, who are putting in some of that labor. For instance, this is from the 9th century life of Saint Malo, where it talks about how one day he was digging around and weeding from a vine. It just talks about his practice in the day. There's later a miracle involving a bird that lands on his cowl. But anyway, so if you read between the lines where he's talking about working in a vineyard here, there's a couple other anecdotes like that where we see people who are interacting with these vineyards. They're also very likely to be part of these lists of landscapes that we have in this kind of paradise-like landscapes. Also, sometimes in saints' lives, we see rich benefactors who are giving lands to the monastery, and they often have vineyards too in their portfolio of lands. It's definitely if you have a very rich land, vineyards are going to be part of that picture. They're not always mentioned though, but they do come up fairly often. In terms of wine consumption, if we trust our saints' lives, it would suggest that people were barely ever drinking this, because the monks themselves almost never drank wine except when they were actually performing Mass. Almost all of our Breton saints tell us that of course, they would never actually drink wine. They never ate meat. They never had butter, nothing like that. They would just have bread, sometimes barley bread or bread mixed with the flour mixed with ash, and then some vegetables and water only, of course. This is kind of the aesthetic tradition that a lot of these monks are following and that the saints' lives are promoting and telling us was accurate here. Whether or not this was actually what it looked like is definitely much more debatable. As we will see, there is other evidence of viticulture in these monasteries, and we certainly have a lot of evidence in faunal assemblages of meat consumption at monastic sites, which suggests that some people were eating fish and were eating meat, even if apparently St. Malo was not. In terms of common use and drinking of wine, there's very little. There is one story about a man who was struggling with his alcohol consumption and eventually was possessed by demons, repented, and then succeeded in staying sober thereafter. So again, a more cautionary tale about wine consumption. Then when it comes to the charter evidence, here we're on more stable ground. There's quite a lot of references to vineyards in Redon's charters particularly. Sometimes they come in these kinds of passages. This is called an appurtenance clause. So it talks about all the different landscapes that were present at this particular site. So I, Candalo, give to the monastery my lands, including all vineyards and fields, meadows, woodlands, pastures, waters and watercourses, salt pans, and everything pertaining to them. So vineyards are one of the landscapes that we see in these appurtenance clauses. They are not but the most common by far. They are far less frequently mentioned than the fields, meadows, woodlands, pastures, waters. I feel like maybe they have more references than salt pans, but even that, debatable. So they do get mentioned relatively frequently, but not nearly as much as the other landscape types. There are also some charters that talk about individual vineyards being gifted to the monastery, and sometimes we get references to taxes or tithes being paid in wine alongside other goods. It's more likely that we see taxes paid in grain or in animal products, but wine does sometimes get a mention there. Here, I think it's interesting when we plot these references and see where within our assortment of charter evidence they occur. So again, this is what the general skew looks like. The larger circles, by the way, are places with more than one reference. So these are the appurtenance clauses where we have appurtenance clauses, essentially. So now if we break it down by landscape, this is what it looks like for meadows, for arable lands, woodlands, and waters. As you can see, it matches fairly well. We don't have much of a geographic skew. We can see that the waters, there are a few kind of clustered on the coast that we don't see as often with the other sites. So a little bit with the waters, but in general, almost all of these landscape types are mentioned almost every time that we have these appurtenance clauses. So that suggests to me that these were very, very common. Almost any kind of rural holding that would be given to the monastery would have arable lands, woodlands, meadows, waters. Woodlands, a little bit less often. Those other three, very, very, very common. Now, when we look to vineyards, the picture looks pretty different. First of all, there's not that many of them. Secondly, there's fewer of these that are clustered in the area north of Redon. There's more a bit to the south. So if you're trying to compare, most of Redon's holdings are right around the monastery, but skewing a little bit to the north. When it comes to the vineyards, they don't have that skew. now they're looking a little bit more southward than most of the other references. And interestingly, this area between Rennes and Nantes is exactly where Gregory of Tours talks about wine in the 6th century. So there seems to be, again, skewing more to the southeast of Redon's already southeastern skewing holdings, that we get more of these references to wine cultivation. So not clearly we can see from this that people were growing vineyards in Brittany, and that they were most likely using them also in Brittany. But we do also have some references to monasteries and Breton dukes as well, sourcing wine from elsewhere in France and importing it in. The best example here is from the 9th century life of Saint Samson, the second life of Saint Samson, which describes a conversation between him and Saint-Germain, the abbot of the Parisian monastery, talking about what their monasteries have a lot of and what they don't have a lot of. Saint Samson says, our monastery has no wine, but we have a lot of honeycomb. Saint-Germain says, well, we really need beeswax in our monastery for lighting. Samson asks what Saint-Germain has a lot of in his monastery, and he says, our monastery has many very fertile vineyards. So of course, after this conversation, they decide that every year they are going to do a trade with beeswax going over to Paris from Samson's monastery in Dole, that's kind of in northern Brittany, and then importing wine in turn. So this might suggest that it wasn't easy to have wine cultivation in the region around Dole, which was causing the monastery to look elsewhere. Or maybe the wine just tasted better from Paris than the ones that they could have. We don't really know particularly. There are a couple other anecdotes where we have monks in Redon who were also importing wine, and we certainly know that they were gathering wine from their own estates as well. And also we have some Breton dukes doing the same thing. And they were importing wine from just further east than Brittany and Anjou. So this is part of the general picture, that there was wine cultivation in Brittany, but we also do see importation. Now, when it comes to the archaeobotanical evidence, the pollen evidence, that kind of thing, it's a bit tricky with wine because it's hard to tell domesticated vitis vine from wild vitis. And because we only have often a couple little grains of pollen, it's hard to know whether that just happened to be from wild pollen versus whether it was actually cultivated. So vine is also a really poor, I didn't really talk much about pollen here, happy to, if people want to ask me questions later. Vine is a poor pollinator, there's not a lot of pollen. So even if you're taking a pollen sample in a vineyard, you probably only get still less than 10% of the pollen you'll find in that will be vine pollen. So that shows us if you're not actually in a vineyard, it's going to be even less. So it's hard to tell how much vine cultivation we have. And in Brittany, there are quite a lot of sites that do have archaeobotanical evidence. We have some of these grape seeds or other wood coming from vine. And we also do have some with vine pollen. We have some at Landévennec, at Redon, and at a couple rural sites as well, in Rennes as well. But it's hard to know whether those were the result of deliberate cultivation or whether they were reflective of wild vine growth. This is one example. This was in Rennes, so we can see some of these grape seeds that they found on the site. And yes, some of the archaeologists, I think in this case, I think there was some local vine cultivation. Some of the other sites, they're a bit less convinced. The evidence is a bit ambivalent here. So all of that together, what kind of picture do we have about these landscapes? Ultimately, I hope that this talk has shown a little bit about what we do know about environmental history in this period, about what kind of things these texts and these other kinds of evidence do tell us, and about the gaps that we still have and the work that there still can be done, but also fundamentally some things that we may never know with 100% certainty for this region. In my research, I've tried to combine these different strands to get a more granular idea and to get a better understanding of what this actually looked like. Only by adding in the archaeobotany can we actually see what vegetables we might have found in these monastic gardens. We don't have any textual sources that will tell us that from Brittany. There are some from elsewhere in the early medieval world, but not from Brittany. But it's only also from the texts that we get more of an idea of the pests that people were dealing with, or how they were thinking about these landscapes. How people were thinking about them was also an important element when we talk about landscape change and environmental history during this period. So altogether, I think we've demonstrated here that these kind of cultivated plants, not cereals, the others, gardens, orchards, vineyards, are very common. We find them all over the place. We find them in rural sites. We find them in urban sites. We find them in monastic sites. They were clearly prioritized by early medieval communities, and they were clearly very practical choices that had important goods that were necessary to supplement people's diets. But ultimately, we are all still left with quite a lot of questions. So, speaking of, feel free to ask me something.
Great talk, thank you. You feature a lot of illustrations in your presentation, and like this one. And I'm wondering, are these from a specific manuscript? Were these illustrations produced in Brittany, or are they from like a later period? Maybe talk a bit about that.
I wish there were early medieval Breton illuminated manuscripts. Oh my God. Sadly, no. They're pretty much all from later manuscripts. Yeah, I think that would be, people do mention that fairly often, which makes sense. They're so striking and they're so beautiful. But I think they can be actually a really interesting source of environmental history. When we talk about what kind of tools people were using, we can see manuscript illuminations of that and all that kind of stuff. For the early Middle Ages, it's quite rare. In Brittany, we don't have any, sadly. So yeah, these illustrations I've chosen don't tell us about Brittany and early medieval Brittany specifically. But they are very fun to look at, so I like to include them anyway. Any other? Yeah.
This might not pertain because he's really early, and I'm thinking probably more like 950-ish start. But I'm wondering if any research in climate history might help kind of not illuminate more necessarily, but maybe help with like the probability of what could have been grown in particular places. I'm just thinking about like the medieval warm period, which isn't starting until I think maybe just after you. But I'm wondering if that impacts like the ability to grow vines, that kind of thing, or the types of fruits that they're able to grow.
Yeah. In theory it could. Climate history is a very complicated topic. It can be very hard to know how these larger trends, so if we're talking about the late antique Little Ice Age, the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age, what do those actually look like for local communities? How does that reflect on the ground? When we're looking at the medieval warm period or the late antique Little Ice Age, does it mean that it was cold? Were there more storms? Would that be something that these coastal communities would be dealing with? Was it colder on average? Would there be less of a growing season? Is there more precipitation? Is there less? All of these kinds of questions, it's not really clear. And you really do need local studies in order to know how those larger trends are reflected on the ground. Sometimes I guess I would say that I am cautious against making kind of simplistic assumptions that late antique Little Ice Age equals cold, equals bad, equals famines, equals bad growing, equals suffering, right? Those are all causal relationships that you kind of have to prove in order to know what that actually looked like. In some regions, the late antique Little Ice Age had more precipitation, some it had less, some it might have, it does depend what region we're looking at. So when we're talking about the cultivation of specific crops and how these trends are reflected, it can be quite hard. There's not a lot of climate evidence from Brittany itself. So a lot of this evidence is taken from alpine tree rings that are in the Alps, very far away from Brittany, right? Or ice core evidence, also taken very far away. So it's hard to know what that actually translated to. I think you are right. There are relationships there. Clearly, climate factors, changing weather conditions, or, stormy conditions, more likely to have freezing conditions, those kinds of things do have an impact on the natural world. They do have an impact on growing conditions. There is a relationship there. But can we actually see it? And can we see it with enough confidence to be able to make arguments about it? That's a lot harder to do. I think in early medieval Brittany, so far, it's quite hard. But there are more studies that are always coming out that are looking at a more local view. So I think hopefully we'll have more information about that down the line. I don't think that Brittany is a great case study for climate history currently, just because we don't have a lot of local data that we can use to build these kinds of narratives. So I think that maybe that was an unsatisfying answer, but yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of related. I was actually thinking about microclimates and landforms, and the people, kind of roughly where there might have been a vineyard. So if you, look for specific kinds of landforms, like, south-facing, sheltered, good soil, and I'm not even sure what kind of soil you need. I mean, you might find places, because they would have been doing exactly that, looking presumably for a good place to put a vineyard, because it's or our garden, obviously. So I don't know if anyone's done that kind of on the ground, walking around looking for landforms work.
There has been some work of that nature, yes. I don't know if vineyards specifically are part of that project, but more in terms of like rural holdings, what we can see about like farming and that kind of field systems and things like that. Also, archaeological sites. I didn't really mention this because I was looking at the archaeobotany specifically for this, but you can often see the different parcels of land, and you can see where these different fields were, how they were shaped, and we can reconstruct that. So there are quite a few signs of gardens in terms of what plot of land was most likely used for what. Was this one for cereals? Was this one used as a garden? Was this one as a vineyard? Trying to get information based on what these plots looked like and how they're shaped and where they are and where they're located. Those are also some of the work that archaeologists do. And certainly there is some evidence that some of these plots on these rural sites were specifically used as gardens. We don't know that for sure, but it is likely that they were, just based on the shape and size and where exactly they were situated. So yes, there is some research in that general, in that field. Yeah.
Thank you. It's really interesting. I have two questions. One is the sort of comparative regional. Are there, based on studies done in regions, not in Brittany, but in neighboring regions, or but in other parts of what is now France?
Yeah.
Are there things that you expected to find in Brittany that you did not, or are there any of these fruits or vegetables? Obviously, there's no specificity on the herbs, it sounds like, but that you have a sense that they traveled from somewhere. I mean, everything, ultimately. So, is there anything you're able to deduce on that score?
So yes, when it comes to fruits and vegetables, it's tough. Archaeobotanical assemblages from Brittany have fewer fruits and vegetables than we find further east in France. So this could be a product of, again, where exactly we're looking within these archaeological sites. We have fewer digs that have seen these trash heaps that are better for the preservation of these compared to other places in France. The vast majority of these are looking at ovens, fireplaces, these kind of drying ovens that are used for drying grain. That is a kind of very, very common in Brittany and not so much elsewhere. So the skew of cereals versus other kinds of plants is different in Brittany compared to elsewhere, and it's hard to know whether that's because they had fewer of these fruits and vegetables compared to elsewhere, or just because they had these different drying processes that then we're excavating and looking at. So hard to know when it comes to that kind of thing. But there is some evidence of some other kinds of plants that are being spread between. And one interesting example is the story of oats, which is a whole different talk, which I have given before. So I got the PowerPoint if everybody wants to stick around and learn about cereals. But so there's a lot of oat cultivation in Brittany, more so than we find further east in France. Normandy, I think, also has a decent amount. Brittany has a lot of oat cultivation. Obviously, it has wheat and barley as well, but oat is particularly prevalent. And so there's quite a lot of conversation on why exactly. It's very cold tolerant. It's better in more acidic soils, like Brittany's has quite acidic soils. But also, interestingly, we start seeing a new kind of oats that appear only after we have Viking incursions into Brittany. So to get a little bit of Viking history in Brittany, Brittany was actually a kind of Viking colony, isn't really the right word, but the kind of government completely disintegrated for a few decades, and we have a Viking kind of lordship in the area, and we find this new kind of oats, Avena strigosa, that we didn't see before, that we do see in previous sites in Scandinavia, and that seem to have been imported into Brittany by Vikings. So this kind of is, I find, really interesting because it turns on its head this idea that we have of the Vikings being these rampaging, they just show up and destroy things. But they also bring their oats, and then we see people in Brittany cultivating them. So clearly this story is more complicated. So in that case, we do have evidence of particular crop being imported into Brittany from elsewhere. But for the fruits and vegetables, not particularly, and it's partly because we don't have a lot. It's hard to know based on the current archaeobotanical evidence in Brittany. Yes?
Oh, yeah. You mentioned about how these monks were claiming they're doing manual labors. To what extent are they true? Do they also, I guess, I don't know, in some way hire other local farmers to do that? And in what ways would you evaluate their, I guess, agricultural skills? Is that the sources that support them?
The skills of individual monks?
I mean, in general.
Monks, these monasteries became major landlords throughout the early Middle Ages. Obviously, there's a big difference between a monastery that was just recently founded and then one centuries later that is one of the main landlords of the area. When we look at the larger kind of economic trends that we see in Redon's charters, this is drawn from the work of Wendy Davies, shout out. She talks about how we can see this kind of accumulation of power in the hands of the monastery as they're getting more and more and more and more lands that used to be in the hands of the local communities and now is increasingly being dominated by this one particular landlord. So in terms of were they doing all the manual labor themselves? No, they absolutely had tenants who they were charging rents and who were doing this work for them. Whether or not it was always inaccurate, particularly in the kind of early days of a monastery, that is harder to say, and it's harder to know about that. So I'm not going to say that it never happened that you would see monks also doing manual labor, but certainly the more wealthy cases that we get near the end of our period and by the 9th century, the monks are themselves major landlords. They don't need to be working in the fields. They can be spending their time in prayer. Yeah,
my question is about lives of saints as historical sources, which on the one hand I think is really interesting, but I wanted to know more. Presumably these were oral traditions that got written up a couple, 2-3 centuries later. Did they get written up in the same locality? Presumably not. They were probably written up in Paris or Rome or further afield. One wonders how much anachronistic things and geographically not relevant things end up inserting themselves into these narratives. So then this gets to the question of, well, then what do you actually think that you can get from these, and what things do you have to be much more skeptical about? They say it's an oak tree. No, they would have used oak, but it could be a big tree of any type. Is it just to locate in time? Okay, we know later from scientific evidence that there are these kinds of trees, so the lives of saints only give us evidence that that these date from at least the 7th century. How do you use them, and what can't you trust?
Honestly, this is kind of an open question. Different scholars will have different interpretations. of how trustworthy or not they find these. These are really important questions that you're hitting on. It is not clear that these saint lives are accurately depicting the events on the ground, either in the 6th century when they're claiming to, or in the 9th century. I think a lot of the kind of stories that come into saint lives that are not accurate to Brittany are kind of inherent in the genre, which is that these are really taking a lot of inspiration from the earliest saint lives, the lives of the desert fathers in Egypt. So we sometimes get references to landscapes and to plants that you would not be finding very frequently in Brittany, but were much more representative of these kind of more desert, more Mediterranean climates. So some also of the animals are similar, where you're not likely to find those in Brittany. So yes, sometimes we can see things where we go, that doesn't feel right. But then you also see things where you're like, wait, this feels extremely accurate. And it's very hard to weigh those, and they can appear next to each other in the same passage. For instance, I put quite a bit about the foundation of Landévennec at the beginning of this presentation, right? I mean, about the gardens being part of that story. That was a saint's life that was written by a monk of Landévennec in the 9th century. And it is clear that this was a person who was familiar with the region in the saint's life. There's a part where he describes where Landévennec is situated. He describes the geography of the area and what the peninsula looked like where the monastery was founded. And if you've been there or if you look at pictures of it, it looks very accurate in what he's describing in terms of where the sun was, what the shape of the coastline looked like, all that kind of stuff, right? But of course, right next to that description, we will get this kind of Edenic fantasy landscape. So you're constantly having to read these with that kind of critical eye and toggle between, is this actually reflecting the experience of someone who is living in this region, or living in the early Middle Ages at all? Or are we repeating these hagiographical tropes that we see in these earlier saints' lives, which are not from Brittany at all? It really is both. And I'm always trying to kind of make the best judgment I can about how much I trust or I don't. I think these are kind of essential questions. I do think that these sources still have value. It's not worth throwing them away because we can't fully trust them. But yes, we can't fully trust them, and we do have to be very critical. So part of that is kind of knowing what these hagiographical tropes are, and then when you see them repeated in different saints' lives, you go, okay, so they're taking that from that. Whereas if you see something that you never saw in any other saint's life ever, that might also be more reflective of a more local tradition that is being repeated here. So yeah, it's always balancing between these different things and trying to make the best judgment that you can. But yeah, these are really fascinating sources. They're not very easy for historians to work with, but they are really, really fun. So yeah, hope that answered that. Yeah.
You mentioned that this was a chapter that didn't quite make it in your dissertation ultimately, so I'm wondering, where does it fit in the broader scope of your work?
Yeah. I broke down the thesis and book project in the different landscape types. So I started with waters, as these monasteries were founded usually in coastlands, and then we turned to woodlands, arable lands, meadows and pastures, and then the other cultivated plants was supposed to fit at the end of that, and didn't quite make it in time. So yes, if you want to know about any of these other landscape types and how they all fit in, very happy to discuss it, yes. There are definitely quite a lot of similarities across these different landscapes. It's hard to separate them out that way sometimes because there's so much overlap. These are working next to each other. You have a garden with an orchard attached that's right next to the meadow, right next to the field, right next to the woodland, right next to the water course. They're all kind of operating together. So a lot of these trends we can see throughout these different ones. But I still found that was the best way to break it up and to try to get access to the environmental history in this region. So yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you just say a word if there were any draft animals involved in any of the gardens? Because presumably they would need manure and stuff for the soil. So is there anything in the saints' lives about that, or any other evidence that you found?
Were there draft animals? Yes. In the gardens? They don't say. I would have put it in here if there was a description of a draft animal or manure fertilizer in the garden. We don't see that, but there certainly were draft animals, yes. We have evidence across our sources of sheep, cattle, horses, donkeys, all sorts of different kinds of ungulates, also lots of pigs. All of these I can talk about at length, honestly. So yes, there were draft animals. And again, this is part of, they kind of coexist all together. I think a lot of the kind of larger argument that I make, or the larger point, is to show how these rural communities were using all of these different landscape types in tandem, and they were using them reflective of their local conditions. In some regions they could have salt pans, in some regions they could have vineyards, in some regions they were focusing a lot more on meadows, some regions were better for cereal. So they could pick and choose to rely on one more than another depending on where they were, but there was still quite an effort to diversify as much as possible what they had access to. And this was able to kind of maintain stability in the face of challenges that they might experience, whether that's, a Frankish invasion or adverse climate conditions. In terms of the disease landscape, if anyone preempting any questions about that, because people often ask me about, was there plague? I don't know. No evidence at all. No evidence at all. There's very little evidence of any kind of disease, epidemic disease, in our sources in Brittany, which is not to say that there wasn't any. We just don't see it. And it's also hard to get that from human remains from Brittany because the acidic soils are pretty bad for bone preservation. Getting into the weeds on that one, but yeah.
Just wondered, in reference to animals,
Mhm.
and you earlier talked about pests and this one, but is there any archaeological evidence either of, I assume that this wouldn't have lasted, but like structures built to protect gardens from animals, of archaeological evidence that would suggest gardens placement, like what I would consider the kitchen garden, right beside a building where cooking will happen, evidence of the different kinds of tools that might have been used for gardening.
I don't know details about that. I think, yes, we are looking at enclosed and protected gardens in a lot of these cases. But I'm not sure exactly what kinds of fencing that they were using, particularly on these sites compared to others. There was definitely quite a bit of, in general, we have a lot of wooden kind of coppiced grown fencing that were used to differentiate the field systems here. But I'm not sure specifically if gardens were treated differently. In terms of pests and trying to exclude them from your lands, there's a very fun story in one of the saints' lives about the saint's lands being overrun by a whole bunch of wild animals and trampling all over, and it was in his fields, not particularly his gardens. That was very fun, and of course in that case it was the power of prayer that was able to get rid of them. But yeah, the practical story here, I'm not sure exactly, and I don't know if gardens were treated differently, but I would expect that there would be some kind of fencing, most likely wooden. Yeah.
You mentioned how a lot of these sources you're using don't have that much detail in terms of like the types of fruits or herbs that are being grown in these gardens. And I'm wondering, and this might not be relevant to your particular argument, but in terms of sources, have you looked at, I don't know if there was any kind of trading done between these monasteries? I mean, you mentioned that example of them trading beeswax and wine to a Parisian monastery. Have you looked at more records like that? Are there a large collection of trading ledgers? I mean, I'm not sure if that would be something to find in this period, but
not really. If such records existed, I would love to see them, but no, not really. There is some evidence in the texts of trade. It's kind of these one-off kind of sources that talk about it. Sometimes in the hagiographies and sometimes in charters we see it. We also can get some evidence of trade in the archaeological record in different ways, but more detailed accounting where we have a ledger of this is on this shipment, where we have this amount, we don't, unfortunately, we don't really have that from this period. Yeah, I always find it a bit, it's fun talking to historians of different periods, and especially to modernists, and trying to show how very, very different the textual record looks in my period. I once gave an entire conference talk about one sentence in a saint's life, and that's kind of what it is. When you're working with early medieval texts, you have to put in a lot of effort to really read into some of the very thin record that we do have. But I hope I've tried to make the case here that by expanding the kinds of things that we are considering, especially this is very relevant for environmental history, it can help to kind of plug some of those gaps and to get this more diverse understanding of how people were living in this period that is quite challenging as a historian. Any other? Yeah.
I'm just so curious about using archaeobotany, which I didn't even know was a thing until today. So I just wondered if you could, like, the way that you tell us that you mean here is just sort of like to confirm, like you're jumping into these articles to confirm the existence of certain things. But just, do you want to just say more about your adventures in archaeobotany and what it can tell you as a historian?
Mm-hmm.
And have you talked to have you presented this work to archaeobotanists?
Yes, yeah.
And what
So-
do they think of it?
Yeah, okay, yes, happy to. So essentially how this worked for me, I knew that I wanted to use an interdisciplinary source base to get at environmental history, and I didn't know about archaeobotany either until, sadly, fairly far along. I knew about palynology, so I was interested in looking at pollen records, and pollen is a great source for environmental history. Again, happy to talk about it. But I knew about pollen. I was doing some research about what pollen records we had from Brittany, and I essentially spent 5 months doing research in Nantes with the rescue archaeologists there, where I was kind of being supervised by one Merovingian archaeologist, but I was looking at their kind of trove of, these are unpublished archaeological reports for the most part, right? So they need to create these before they can have the building projects, but they don't necessarily publish them in traditional academic publishing unless it's a particularly important site, because these archaeologists are incredibly busy. They have the next site, the next site, and the next site to work with. So I showed up in France and I'm like, I want to study landscapes. This is what my project is looking at. I'm interested in if there's any pollen data that you guys have that isn't on the European pollen database, and all that kind of stuff. And immediately my supervisor's like, okay, so you want the archaeobotany then? You want the sites with the archaeobotany? And I'm like, what? And then she told me that it exists, and also and kind of helped me to get at those records that are early medieval sites that have these kinds of assemblages. I was also looking at ones with pollen too, obviously. And it was an unexpected kind of treasure trove, honestly. There's so much that we can learn from these. I didn't really get into what we can learn from preserved charcoals, so that's a slightly different discipline, anthropology. It's part of archaeobotany. But that can tell us also a lot about what kind of woods people were burning. So it tells us about their kind of practices, but also what woods were in the vicinity of the sites. What were they using for their bigger logs versus their kindling? What was the quality of these woods? Were they gathered from the forest floors and eaten up by insects? Were they pristine? All these kinds of questions that I truly did not know anything about when I first arrived in France to do that research. So when I was talking with the archaeologists who were working in Brittany, and I was explaining to them my project, they were very supportive of it, for sure. They were surprised by it in the sense of the scope, because if you're an archaeologist, looking at all of Brittany is kind of impossible. They were like, how would you do that, though? Brittany is huge. We have hundreds and hundreds of archaeological sites across Brittany. And I was like, right, but in the texts I have like 20 saints' lives and 300 charters. So yeah, I'm looking at Brittany. So the kind of difference in the scope was quite interesting. But in general, they were very supportive of the project. Oftentimes, this kind of larger view is something that they don't really do as archaeologists, not just because it's not kind of normal to how their working process is. They're like focusing on one site, but also because they don't always have the time, because they are working on the next site and the next site. And so looking back and integrating it with the textual record isn't so much a process that any of them have really done. There are some very rare cases where you have a charter and an archaeological site at the same place or something like that, but that's quite rare. So yeah, it was really interesting spending that time learning from them and talking about the differences in our approach and our methods, but it was also really useful for me. Obviously, it's a very different vocabulary working with these sources, so I had to learn a lot about that and how it worked and what it meant and what I could learn from these reports. Something that I think is important about if you do want to do interdisciplinary research is to be cognizant of where your area of specialization is versus where other people's expertise come in. And you can't be an expert at everything. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not a palynologist. I'm a historian, so my expertise comes in reading and analyzing the textual evidence. If I want to use this evidence from these other fields, it requires me to talk to people who are actually experts and make sure that my understanding of it is accurate. And also it goes both ways. A lot of environmental history-related studies that are done by scientists, for instance, they might have a historian in the group that's just writing the introduction or something. Maybe not even that. And sometimes you can get quite a lot of miscommunication when you're reading interdisciplinary evidence. So that is very much a challenge in doing work in this field in general, trying to understand where the boundaries of my own abilities are and not to take on everything, because I can very easily misinterpret the results that I'm reading. So when it came to these archaeological reports, I was not present at these digs. I was not writing the reports. I was reading what had already been produced. But fortunately, I did have access to a lot of the people who had written them. So I could ask them my questions and help get some further education and stuff.